It's nice to see you all here. I'm Carla Nielsen. I'm the Curator of Literature in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at Columbia. And we're very excited to be sponsoring this talk tonight with the Casa Hispanica at the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures here at Columbia. I am going to just really quickly introduce Nicole A. Hughes, who is a PhD candidate here in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures, and she is going to introduce tonight's speaker, who is William Sherman of the University of York.
It is a pleasure and an honor for me to present William H. Sherman for tonight's session of the Book History Colloquium here at Columbia University, which is also honored to be Professor Sherman's alma mater. William Sherman is Professor of Renaissance and Early Modern Studies in the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York in the UK, where he was also the founding director of the Center for Renaissance and Early Modern Studies and associate editor of Shakespeare Quarterly. He has held visiting positions at Caltech, Queen Mary at the University of London, the Keio University in Tokyo, as well as fellowships at the Folger Shakespeare Library, the Huntington Library, the New York Public Library, the National Maritime Museum, and Bard Graduate Center. He has received grants from such prestigious institutions as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Mellon Foundation, and the Bibliographical Society. The study of print culture is of great interest to historians and literary scholars today, and Professor Sherman's work has been instrumental for recent developments in this field. His work has opened a vast archive of information about the lives of books and their place in the lives of their readers by examining their markings and other signs of engagement and use. His work has reinvigorated the study of book production and book collecting and helped give birth to the exciting new area of study that examines the use of books by their readers. In Professor Sherman's first book, a monograph of the Elizabethan scholar Dr. John Dee, entitled The Politics of Reading and Writing in the English Renaissance, he presents Dee as a well-connected advisor to the academic, courtly, and commercial circles of his day, in large part by focusing on the doctor's reading practices in his massive library. Two more recent publications of his have proved seminal to the field just described. First, a book which many of us here know, entitled Used Books, Marking Readers in Renaissance England, and second, a special issue of the Huntington Library Quarterly on prison writings in early modern England, which won the inaugural Voyager Award of the MLA's Council of Editors of Learned Journals. Professor Sherman has also published widely on Renaissance drama and travel writing. He has edited William Shakespeare's Tempest for W.W. Norton and Company and Ben Jonson's Alchemist for Cambridge University Press. And he is currently completing the Arden Early Modern Drama edition of Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta. Recently, Professor Sherman's interest in the relationship between knowledge and power have led to a number of projects on the history of espionage and cryptography, which include a forthcoming exhibition on the birth of secret communication called Decoding the Renaissance, which will open at the Folger Shakespeare Library in November 2014, and a book entitled How to Make Anything Signify Anything. Professor Sherman's current pursuits explore the interface between word and image. He is editing a collection of essays with Juliet Fleming and Adam Smith on Renaissance collage, and working on the study of visual marginalia called The Reader's Eye. Tonight he joins us for a talk that carries the same title, The Reader's Eye Between Annotation and Illustration. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sherman to Columbia.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you all for coming, especially those of you who in advance have to go off to another talk after this. So this talk is part of the monograph in progress that Nicole just mentioned, what I'm calling The Reader's Eye. It explores the role of images in the margins of books and the changing relationship between reading, seeing, and drawing during the first few centuries after the invention of printing. It's closely connected to a cluster of new projects on the interface between the verbal and the visual, but it grows directly from the research on readers' marks that I've been doing since I first caught the marginalia bug as a graduate student back in the late 80s. Now, I hope this works. Let's see. Nope. I did the wrong thing.
The right button. Or, yeah, no, left.
Left button?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. That work culminated a few years ago in Used Books, a study of the fascinating traces left behind by Renaissance readers in the volumes that passed through their hands and down into ours. As I look back over the table of contents of that book and the body of evidence it set out to survey, there is one gap that strikes me as especially large, one phenomenon above all that's now calling me to account, and that is what might be described as visual modes of response to the text, from the use of images in the imagination to the presence of pictures alongside the text. Now, I did at least gesture toward the topic in my chapter on manicules, the pointing hands that litter the margins of so many books and manuscripts between the 13th and 18th centuries. But I subsumed them under the general heading of nonverbal marks without considering them as properly visual marks, and nowhere did I discuss in any detail the surprisingly complex ways in which readers used images as well as words to make their books meaningful, beautiful, or useful. In my desire to restore the humble hand to the lofty field of reading, I went so far as to claim that Renaissance readers took up their texts with a more acute awareness of the symbolic and instrumental power of the fingers than ever before or since. Not sure I would still stand by that claim, but I made it. But in doing so, I clearly emphasized the hand at the expense of the eye and lost sight, as it were, of sight itself. The Renaissance reader who pointed the error of my ways to me was none other than Bernardo Bembo, whose ostentatious manicule graced the very cover of my book, lifted from this typical page in his remarkable commonplace book at the British Library. And you can see, actually there was also a manicule on the spine, which was that one. So, in January 2008, less than 1 month after Used Books was published, I stumbled across a volume at Stanford University that turned out to be one of the most important lost books from Bembo's long since dispersed library. I was sitting at a table in the rare book reading room, killing time before giving a graduate class on marginalia. On my left, I had a copy of Used Books, as you saw, and see here. And on the right, I had a pile of books that the librarian had pulled from my class because he knew they contained marginalia. Didn't say anything else about them. And when I opened the 3rd or 4th volume, an edition of Pliny the Younger's letters, printed in 1483, I nearly fell off my seat. Such is the power of manicules to imprint themselves in the memory and to stand in for the body of a specific reader, that my nerves knew that this book was Bembo's even before my brain had a chance to think about it. And as I made my way through the rest of the volume, I found a whole theater of gesturing hands and a full display of Bembo's strikingly visual techniques for marking the text, testifying to his gift, what might be described, with pun intended, as drawing attention, as well as his love of puns. Nota Bene became the title of the chapter that I've written about this book. Now, what caught my own eye immediately was the distinctive hands and fingers that allowed me at a flash to identify the book as Bembo's. But alongside the manicules, I was startled to find what I'm tempted to call opticules, staring in at the text from the margins, eyes in profile, sometimes jostling for space, with pointing fingers in a remarkable act of hand-eye coordination. And what at first glance looked like inscrutable squiggles, and I hope at least one of these will look like an eye to you, turned out to be the uncanny profiles of eyes, complete with lids, lashes, and even expressive brows. The whole ensemble brings back to life a long-dead reader who not only drew eyes, but might be said to have developed an eye. Now, most of Bembo's techniques are on display in the second page of the book. In the volume's second letter, signaled by the red Q, Pliny writes to his friend Caninius Rufus in their native Como and asks him how his lovely house outside the town is doing. How, he wonders, is its colonnade where it is always springtime? And what of the shady plane trees? Bembo tags those trees in the margin, marks them with a star, and adds in the top margin with a matching star a line from Virgil's Georgics that also praises the shade of plane trees. The rest of the letter wonders if his friend is able to shut himself up with his books in the complete comfort of his retreat, or, quote, is as usual forever being called away to look after your affairs. This scenario, all too familiar from Bembo's own life as an ambassador and civil servant, is bristling with keywords and adorned with 2 kinds of bracket, 2 kinds of trefoil or flower, an emphatic manicule, and a pair of attentive eyes, one on each side of the text. Now, Bembo also drew pictures, as it happens, in the margins of his Pliny. Here is the first letter in Pliny's third book, which describes a visit to a 77-year-old senator named Spurinna, who had retired from his distinguished career, and since he was still enjoying good health, regular study, and excellent conversation, Bembo described it as an old age worthy of emulation, and noted, quote, "Old age has brought him nothing but prudence," copying that sentence into a lozenge or shield, and sketching an evocative profile of the admirable Spurinna at the head of what was evidently one of his favorite letters. Here, one last example from this book, perhaps the most eye-catching opening in the entire volume, and certainly the letter that the architectural historians among you, if there are any, will find most exciting, is Book 2, Letter 17, in which Pliny gives Clusinius Gallus such a detailed account of his villa at Laurentum that it has enabled scholars to reconstruct the layout of the entire estate, even though there is virtually no archaeology, and which Bembo clearly used here as a blueprint for his own beloved villa, the Nonianum, the country estate that he developed outside Padua and left as a legacy to his much more famous son, Cardinal Pietro Bembo. While there are no pictures in this letter, we could hardly ask for a more vivid example of Bernardo's graphic sensibility. And the phrase he has used along the margin to summarize the letter applies both to Pliny's letter and to Bembo's own annotations, to their attitudes toward places for reading and their appreciation of the ekphrastic art of painting through words. Laurentum sum graphicae pingit, is Laurentum graphically painted or depicted. So it's fitting that Bernardo, I think, did not draw a picture, but styled his letters to give them a shape that would invoke both an architectural form and the textual form known as the paraph, used to mark out sections for easy retention. As in other humanist books, then, we find here an array of epigraphic, mnemonic, and iconic inscriptions that capture aspects of the classical world and bring them to bear on present circumstances, and evidence of someone cultivating a graphic style that did work of a kind that we have barely begun to see, much less study, and for which I want to suggest we are poorly served by both methodology and terminology. After all, I'm by no means alone in having overlooked the extent to which the visual and verbal worked and played together during the Renaissance and beyond in the margins of books and the minds of readers. While the study of verbal marginalia now occupies a well-thumbed corner of book history, the study of visual marginalia has been almost entirely restricted to manuscript illumination, where it is largely, though not exclusively, a matter of production rather than reception. This blind spot, I would say, is built into our disciplinary divisions. There has been until recently very little dialogue between historians of reading and historians of art and architecture, for instance. It's also bound up, more importantly, with some of our deepest narratives about periods and media, including the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance and the transition from manuscripts to printed books. According to the standard accounts, indeed, the Renaissance was precisely that moment in Western history when the long-standing relationship between word and image broke down, and the ancient link in books between vision and cognition was truly and well and truly severed. Now, for Aristotle, the eyes had not just been the chief organ of perception, but the ultimate source of clear and lasting knowledge. In the opening paragraph of the Metaphysics, Aristotle observed, "We prefer sight, generally speaking, to all the other senses." The reason is that of all the senses, sight best helps us to know things and reveals many distinctions. And the De Anima offered what may well serve as the cognitive archetype for all ancient and medieval psychology. To paraphrase the always lucid account of Mary Carruthers from the Book of Memory, all sensory input, including words on a page, ends up in the form of mental pictures, phantasmata, or in Aristotle's terms, a kind of icon, that can be seen by the mind's eye. It is impossible, Aristotle says, even to think without a mental picture. The same affection is involved in thinking as in drawing a diagram. But if vision was the noblest of the senses from Plato to Descartes, as Martin Jay suggested in Downcast Eyes, The last century of its reign was troubled by a succession crisis. In the words of James Knapp, we witness an attempt to separate the reasoned, stable, and implicitly verbal world of morality from the unstable, emotional realm of visual experience in the 16th century. Michael Camille attributes the increasing effort to bring the visual image under the control of the word to the breakdown of established truths in the Renaissance, fueled in part by Reformation thought. A great rift, he says, opens up between words and images. Language is now in a separate realm, written in discrete boxes, or in fields hanging in the picture space. Now, in this account, the conventions of print put an end to the experiments in mixed media that were so common in medieval culture, separating word and image into their proper places, and banishing from the book altogether much of the visual play that Camille captured in his brilliant study, Image on the Edge. Two influential books, Joseph Leo Kerner's The Reformation of the Image and Stuart Clark's Vanities of the Eye, have added nuance and force to this picture, encouraging us to see how quickly and thoroughly the Renaissance relationship with vision turned sour. The Protestant Reformation brings a new iconoclastic spirit that purges the idolatrous image in favor of a purified word, replacing eye service with ear service. And the scientific revolution offers a new model of the eye itself, which is not only passive rather than active, but far less reliable as an instrument of perception than, say, the telescope, microscope, or camera obscura. So all in all, to borrow Stuart Clark's felicitous phrase, this is the moment when European culture can be said to have lost its optical nerve. The way he puts it. So, if that's true, what are we to make of an example like this, which shows no such disenchantment with the pleasures and powers of the eye, no neat compartmentalization of textual and pictorial space, no neatness, in fact, of any kind? James Russell's recent PhD thesis at Durham analyzes the annotations and surviving copies of what may be the most beautiful and enigmatic book ever printed, the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, printed by Aldous in 1499, and he's discovered layers of interactive visual reading of astonishing complexity. Now, the printed words in the book offer a dream vision within a dream vision, and the narrative often pauses to offer extended verbal descriptions that are accompanied by all kinds of illustrations, including buildings, ruins, and gardens strewn with epigraphic fragments. But some readers, as Russell has shown, went to great lengths to work out their own sense of the structures built up in the text, both verbal and visual, with the text guiding and licensing the reader's architectural, mathematical, and in some cases even magical sensibilities. This looks like one of those books that seems to require the active work of the eye for sense to be made of and with it. The same might be said, as we shall see, of a surprising number and range of other texts, including Dante's Divine Comedy, Aesop's Fables, and Livy's Great History of Rome. And if there are certain books that seem to license the practice of marginal drawing, there are some subjects that absolutely depend on it. There's now an enormous body of literature devoted to what might be called the visual culture of science in early modern Europe, with fields from geometry to botany, drawing heavily on diagrams, illustrations, and emblems. Not surprisingly, these practices are even more common in the field of art and architecture. Books on drawing, like this one, are often accompanied, as we might expect, by readers' drawings. This is the page devoted to how to draw an eye. There are excellent examples, too, from the margins of the period's architectural treatises, the subject of a PhD dissertation by Columbia's own Kate Izzard, though, as she suggests, much of the relevant evidence for these kinds of readers takes us outside the pages of manuscripts and books into other kinds of collections, including sketchbooks and scrapbooks. Recent work on Leonardo and Michelangelo, finally, has found in their miscellaneous papers a set of fundamental and far-reaching connections between the verbal and the visual, between textual and artistic practice. And in Michelangelo, A Life on Paper, Leonard Barkin argues, fantastic book, that we cannot understand Michelangelo without a radical sense of the way that pictures and words entangled themselves within his creative imagination. But as I want to suggest in my talk today, there's ample evidence for this radical entanglement within the covers of all kinds of books, even where we would not expect to find them. Between medieval illumination and modern illustration, in fact, there turn out to be many cases of marginal visualizations and countless traces of reading as a visual mode, from isolated doodles to fully fledged ornamental or pictorial schemes. Now, in my other work on marginalia, I found that such evidence is generally less useful for the answers it provides, particularly to questions that we want answered. They never answer what you want answered. And better for the questions it raises. And the examples I've already shown, I think, are probably sufficient to add a few new questions to our collective agenda. Classic question, are people who scribble in books aberrant or exemplary? Maybe the key question. Are drawings in the margins signs of attention or inattention? Strokes of spontaneity or sites of meditation? What work do they do and who do we think they're doing it for? Who do they think they're doing it for? What can marginal marks teach us about the spatial protocols of a page? What's the best way to describe the tools and products of the reader's eye? Are these annotations, illustrations, doodles, sketches, prostheses, icons, mnemonic aids? In what way did Renaissance readers see reading as an embodied act, and how did the eye alongside the hand serve as the instrument of apprehension? And finally, are the eyes of Renaissance readers different in any significant way from those of medieval readers, or for that matter, modern readers? And if so, in which ways? Now, the person who I think is probably best positioned to help us answer these questions is the so-called Prince of Humanists, Desiderius Erasmus. At first glance, that suggestion may strike you as odd. As an artist, for starters, Erasmus was no Michelangelo. He's only known to have produced a handful of images, and this playful self-portrait from the Scholia on the Letters of St. Jerome may be the best of the bunch. It's nice when you've got Alberti, people like Da Vinci out there who can seemingly do everything. Well, Erasmus was great with words, but he was not so good at drawing. It was nice. More seriously, though, Erasmus shared with many of the more ardent Protestant reformers a deep suspicion of the power of images, and while he never went in for wholesale iconoclasm, he certainly associated the visible world with the fallen world and warned his readers to resist its seductions. In his Enchiridion Militis Christiani, first written in 1503, published in revised form in 1518, Erasmus provided an extended gloss on the Augustinian distinction between the inner and outer man. And he observed that the body, being itself visible, takes pleasure in visible things, but the soul, with its heavenly origins, despises those things that are seen, for it knows that they are transitory. He went further in the subsequent section on the rules of true Christianity, defining perfect piety as an attempt to progress, always from visible things to invisible. Since we are but pilgrims in the visible world, we should never make it our fixed abode. But he saved his most vehemently anti-visual comments for a scathing critique on the veneration of relics that leaves little room for doubt about his preference for scriptura over pictura. If you venerate mutant dead ashes and ignore Paul's living image, still speaking and breathing as it were in his writings, is not your religion utterly absurd? You worship the bones of Paul preserved in a relic casket, but do not worship the mind of Paul hidden away in his writings? You make much of a piece of his body visible through a glass covering, and you do not marvel at the whole mind of Paul shining through his writings? You give homage to an image of Christ's countenance, represented in stone or wood or depicted in color. With how much more religious feeling should you render homage to the image of his mind, which has been reproduced in the Gospels through the artistry of the Holy Spirit? So, for a lecture setting out, and in fact a project setting out to explore the relationship between reading, seeing, and drawing, in a key Renaissance figure, Erasmus looks like possibly the worst choice I could have made. But Erasmus, as Panofsky objected in his classic article, Erasmus and the Visual Arts, was not an iconoclast. He cites as evidence a typically balanced passage from the Modus Orandi, or Manner of Prayer, of 1525. Not all images are to be banished from churches, but the people have to be taught in what way to use them. There are images which provoke us to lasciviousness rather than to piety, yet even these we tolerate because we see more harm in eliminating, in tolendo, than in tolerating, in tolerando. And in his De Amabili Ecclesiae Concordia, jumped ahead. Erasmus acknowledged that idolatry is the cult of images, and is a horrible crime. But immediately went on to remind his readers that since the arts of sculpture and painting were once counted among the liberal arts, this silent poetry can at times have a stronger effect on human emotions than a man, even an eloquent one, could ever achieve by words. Now, the first part of that passage places Erasmus firmly within reformist discourse on images, aligning him closely with iconophobia. But the rest of the passage betrays a deep grounding in classical aesthetic theory, invoking Horace's doctrine of ut pictura poesis, as in painting, so in poetry. And as his fellow humanists would have spotted, or in those quotation marks, this phrase, silent poetry, he is here quoting the pro-painting half of Plutarch's famous formulation of what would later become the sister arts. Painting is silent poetry, poetry a speaking picture. And if art, even in these religious writings, peeks through as a surprisingly common subject for Erasmus, Erasmus stands out as a surprisingly common subject for art, generating enough images in different media to fill a thick catalog published a few years ago called Images of Erasmus. This famous drawing by Hans Holbein the Younger captures the ghostly gaze on the left, very ghostly, and disembodied hand of the great Dutch humanist, and served as a study for the much more famous painting of Erasmus and his study. One of two famous paintings that he painted in 1523. Within a couple of years, Holbein had produced another iconic image of his friend and patron, placing him within the kind of architectural frame he had long been designing for the title pages of Erasmus's books and others. And Dürer would add his own engraving of a scholar all but surrounded by the tools of his trade. And then, a few years earlier, a third major artist, Quentin Matsys, took Erasmus as the subject for one of the period's finest portrait medals. As Brian Cummings observed in his Phillips lecture at last year's RSA, Erasmus was one of the few authors in the period, and possibly the first in the culture of print, who was instantly recognizable via their visual image. We are thus confronted with a tension, if not a paradox, at the heart of Erasmus's relationship with the image. The author who warned readers time and again not to make the visible world our fixed abode clearly felt most at home in the scholar's study and the artist's studio. So there's an irony for many modern scholars in the fact that as the iconoclastic project picked up steam around him, Erasmus became more open to the power of images. But Luther followed a similar course, and the Reformation debates only served to highlight for Protestants and Catholics alike the inescapable role of vision in perception and cognition. Embedded within worries about a Mass that mocked the eye or a Eucharist that deceived the senses was what Stuart Clark describes as the matter of images themselves, not just their relationship to other ingredients of worship, but their relationship to what they represent, the question of imaging, the nature and limits of representation. And these questions were for Erasmus by no means new. They had occupied him and his fellow humanists as a pedagogical project long before they became a religious problem. So when we turn to Erasmus's educational works from the 1490s onwards, we quickly discover the extent to which images were already playing a crucial role in the humanist textual program as he received and reshaped it. In his early work on the instruction of young pupils, De Pueris Instituendis, Erasmus acknowledged children learn their stories and fables with greater enthusiasm and remember them more easily if the contents are displayed before their eyes by means of skillful illustration, and if every story is presented through pictures. This had long been a commonplace in writing, and would remain a commonplace in writing about how we find our way in words and in the world, and it lies behind the special place of illustrations in the history of children's literature. Perhaps the most famous example, and longest running example, is Aesop's Fables. And this charming copy of the 1708 edition by Roger Lestrange, recently acquired by the Victoria and Albert Museum, is particularly suggestive. As Lestrange put it in the volume's general preface, it may be laid down in the first place for a universal rule, never to suffer children to learn anything. Now seeing and hearing with them is learning, but what may be all the better for all their lives after. The wisdom of the ancients has been still always wrapped up in veils and figures. For what are the Egyptian hieroglyphics and the whole history of the pagan gods, the hints and fictions of the wise men of old, but in effect, a kind of philosophical mythology, which is in truth no other than a more agreeable vehicle found out for conveying to us the truth and reason of things through the medium of images and shadows. Now, oddly, the illustrations or images provided by Lestrange in this edition are made up entirely of words in the form of moral examples and applications. But the margins of this copy have been heavily illustrated by a rural apothecary for the amusement and edification of his children in ways that look back past the lavish printed editions of the great 17th century with huge full-page engraved images, and also I think forward, especially in the interaction, a very sophisticated and clever placement and visual play of of image around word toward things like the graphic novel or the artist's book. Now, such strategies for effective learning were not restricted to children, and they had their roots in the ancient Greek idea of enargia, usually translated into Latin as evidentia and English as vividness. Now, Erasmus himself provides the period's best definition, and it comes from one of the most famous passages in one of his most famous works, the rhetorical handbook De Copia, where he says, "We employ enargia whenever, for the sake of amplifying or decorating our passage or giving pleasure to our readers, instead of setting out the subject in bare simplicity, we fill in the colors and set it up like a picture to look at, so that we seem to have painted the scene rather than described it, and the reader seems to have seen rather than read. We can take an action which is either in process or completed, and instead of presenting it in bare and insubstantial outline, bring it before the eyes with all the colors filled in, so that our hearer or reader is carried away and seems to be in the audience at a theater." So there are countless examples of Erasmus's own deployment of this technique in his works, particularly in the ever-evolving proto-essays on sententious themes, the adages or adagia. And this example here is quite an interesting one that I can come back to if anyone is interested, where he actually goes into the nature of the eye, comparing it to a mirror and a picture. And a reader has drawn an eye in the margin at the University of Toronto's copy. But his most vivid use of enargia, or of vividness, may well be the Convivium Religiosum, or religious feast, printed in his 1522 Colloquies. That takes the form of a dialogue set at a country house owned by Eusebius, clearly modeled on the humanist villas of Bembo and his contemporaries and their classical models. The opening of the dialogue takes the guests and the readers on a tour of the house and garden, and it not only features ekphrastic descriptions of painted images on the walls, but the descriptions of the scene clearly bring it before our eyes. Eusebius's explanation of the picture of Christ he has placed at the entrance to the garden is particularly telling. The charm of this garden entices many guests, but so strong is the force of custom that hardly any of them passes Jesus without greeting him. I've placed him there instead of the filthy Priapus, as protector not only of my garden, but of everything I own, in short, of body and soul alike. Here, as you see, is a little fountain, bubbling merrily with excellent water. It symbolizes, in a manner, that unique fountain which refreshes its heavenly stream, with its heavenly stream, all those who labor and are heavy laden, and for which the soul, wearied by the evils of this world, pants as, according to the psalmist, does the thirsty heart after tasting the flesh of serpents. Now, this is a masterclass on the interplay of textual and visual, natural and artificial. And the vehicle for this movement is, as it often is for Erasmus and his contemporaries, metaphor or simile, the art of representing one thing by depicting another, an art that is inherently mimetic and, I would say, inescapably visual. This quintessentially Renaissance approach to representation again has its roots in ancient Greece, where from the outset there were in fact two words for parallels or similitudes: parabole, which is the more famous Greek word that carries on into the Renaissance, and icon or ikon. As Marsh McCall explains in a Loeb Guide to Ancient Rhetorical Theories of Simile and Comparison, at least two words, ikon and parabole, are current as technical terms of comparison before Aristotle and throughout ancient Greece. econ far exceeds the others in frequency of use. The sense most consistently fitting the context of these terms is perhaps illustrative comparison or comparative illustration. Now, in the Decopia, Erasmus himself praises Homer above all as the source of portable comparisons. But for many humanists, it would be Dante who supplied an inexhaustible encyclopedia of similes. And the Divine Comedy is another text that has a special power to engage the visual faculties and active pens of its readers. Early manuscripts are lavishly illustrated, and their printed editions often follow suit. But readers also add drawings of their own to make the text's images visible and memorable. And a spectacular example is the great 1481 edition with a long and learned commentary by Landino, Cristoforo Landino. Now the book has 19 printed images based on Botticelli, but this copy, now at the Biblioteca Vallicelliana in Rome, has hundreds of marginal drawings executed by a pair of unusually learned and unusually gifted Italian artists, starting with this extraordinary map of hell that's very closely related to Botticelli's. I don't have time to go into it very much, but I just had to show you a few of these pictures because so far they're probably my favorite examples of illustrated books. Exquisite drawings and very, very rich examples of the way in which the printed text block becomes an active 3D space, absolutely in motion. But what's most interesting in many ways is that the examples that the person or people choose to illustrate are almost without exception similes. It's as if they went through and looked for the words like and as, and picked them out and then drew what it was that it was being compared to. So here, instead of getting a weird, instead of getting a picture of Dante and Virgil descending into hell, which is what you always get, literally always get, this is Dante and Virgil descending into hell, and it's what they hear. It's the sound that they hear, which is described as a wind that blows all before it, including flocks of sheep, and breaks trees down. It's so strong. So that is sound being drawn. Similarly, this is a famous example of the end of Canto V in the Inferno, where Paolo and Francesca's story is so moving that Dante, of course, faints at the end of the canto, and he says, "And I fell like a dead body falls." And again, not Dante, that's the dead body. So it's very, very curious. It's a peculiar, but then in this context of comparative reading, I don't think it is all that unusual. Now, Erasmus spent much of his own time combing ancient texts for metaphors and similes, and published them in the ready-made source book he called Parabolae. But it's clear that he also wished young students to develop these skills for themselves and construct their own storehouses from their own sources for their own needs.